World War II ended over 75 years ago. Weird to think that after 3/4 of a century later, we'd still be talking about a time when a failed painter and pre-Tumblr blogger tried to take over all of Europe and ultimately killed like 6 million people. That's still not up for debate. Sorry, certain elements of the internet. But no matter how we view World War II or what area of it we want to discuss, we always end up going back to roughly the same idea. And that is, you can't forget about evil. Evil is what defines the Nazi Party. Evil is what the Allies defeated in 1945. Evil is what we try to keep away from rising to the surface ever again. But in all that evil, one thing sticks out to me. The one thing that keeps me coming back to this time period and being fascinated by it. And that's the weird shit the Nazis were up to. Look, outside the whole racial purity thing, which don't get me wrong, is utterly horrendous and should be stamped out of existence, but outside of that, the Nazis were into some pretty crazy shit. And yes, I'm talking about the occult. This is not something that is up for debate. We know that they were into this kind of stuff, but there are several competing theories about occultism in the Nazi Party. And some people believe that Hitler fervently believed in it, and others argue that these tales emerged in the wake of the end of the war, when people were really invested and fascinated by the Nazis and trying to understand why things happened the way that they did. It really is up to you to decide if you think that these mass murdering fuckwads did what they did because they were under some spell of some ancient Nordic mysticism or not. But when it comes to the number 2 guy in the party, Henrich Himmler, he very much was into the occult. In fact, in many ways, it was his defining spirit. It is what prompted him to pursue the idea of racial purity as hard as he had. And it was one of the reasons why 6 million people ultimately died. And this is what brings me to Kisme Lake in Bavaria in May 2001. The lake, which is roughly 30 square miles in diameter, is a popular tourist destination and one that until May of 2001 held a very interesting secret within its depths. A local hobby diver by the name of Lou was snooping around the bottom of the lake, and he happened across this golden item in the murky deep. He didn't touch it, but he noted its existence. And while I don't have any information to back this up, I believe that he was talking about it around town. And not long after that, it caught the attention of Jens Essig. Now, Essig, according to reports, is a treasure hunter. Well, after hearing about this golden item that Lou apparently thought was a discarded lampshade, Essig worked a deal with Lou for him to go back and retrieve the item from the lake. And what Lou pulled out of the ground was no lampshade. It was a golden cauldron. Not a cup, not a bowl, a fucking cauldron. This thing was 12 inches high, 20 inches in diameter, and made of 10 kilograms of 18 karat gold. This, at least to Jens Essig, was the absolute find of the century. To Essig, the thought of it being Nazi gold was the furthest thing from his mind, but what he thought he had was an absolute priceless artifact. A golden Celtic cauldron. What we now know as the Kisme Cauldron was originally believed to have been from 200 or 300 AD because it was very similar to the Gundenstrup Cauldron. The Gundenstrup Cauldron is an artifact pulled from a bog in 1891, and it's believed to be from the European Iron Age. It's believed that the Gundenstrup Cauldron was forged by a Thracian silversmith for the Celtic elites, and that the cauldron was not just left in a bog, but was hidden there to be found later. But the owner clearly never came back for it. The connection between the Gundenstrup Cauldron and the Kisme Cauldron is mostly because of the similar engravings. The two are very similar in design, but the question then becomes, who made this golden cauldron and why? But before we get to that, we got to talk about what happened to Jens Essig, because even though the rest of the story is pretty wild, never underestimate human greed and stupidity. After Essig cleaned up the cauldron, he sent it to an art dealer friend of his, who then passed it on to the Bavarian Archaeological Collection in Munich for evaluation. It was here that Essig hit a snag, but not originally considered a snag. The professor who was determining the age and origin of the cauldron dropped a bombshell. He claimed that this cauldron was in fact Celtic, and he called it the discovery of the century, which got a lot of people talking, brought a lot of attention to this object, but he later dropped that proclamation rather quietly, I might add. and then ultimately admitted that it was a forgery. The Kisme Cauldron was not Celtic, but according to this guy, was possibly commissioned by the Third Reich. And therein lies the biggest issue. If it is determined to be Nazi in origin, then Lou and Essig have no stake to the artifact because Bavaria doesn't have a finders keepers law when it comes to Nazi-owned property. At this point, the cauldron would become property of the state. But if they're unable to determine its origin, the state and the finder would then put the item up for auction and split the proceeds. And that's what they decided to do because the official findings could not determine if the cauldron was made during the time of the Celts or if it was made during World War II. So the cauldron was ultimately sold for about 300,000 euros, which was about twice the amount of the gold itself. And here's where things get funny. Jens Essig is reportedly the one who brokered the deal to quote-unquote a reputable private person to purchase the cauldron. This private person was actually a Swiss businessman who wanted to turn this purchase into the deal of a lifetime. So here's what he did. He started marketing the cauldron as the find of the century, something akin to the golden funeral mask of Tutankhamun. And since the rumor of the cauldron being either a replica of the Holy Grail or the Grail itself was circulating at the time, the businessman was actually able to boost the value of this thing from 300,000 to 250 million euros. And given proper promotion like documentaries, a roadshow, etc., the value could go as high as 1.4 billion in US currency. This attracted a lot of investors to the cause, and apparently a lot of money started pulling in. But an investor out of Kazakhstan caught wise to the Swiss businessman's scheme and filed a lawsuit against him. The Swiss authorities stepped in, seized the cauldron, and locked it up until the businessman could sell it to somebody else for about 7 million Swiss francs, which ultimately settled all the claims made against him. So where did the cauldron go next? I'm going to get to that. But first, let's finally dive into the meat of the story, and that is just where the hell this thing came from. Because at first, no one could place the forging of the cauldron to any place in time. Sure, they figured it was from the Nazis, but there was no actual data to back that up. However, according to a Der Spiegel report from 2007, they claim they know who commissioned the cauldron. The report says this: the senior director of the long-established Munich jewelers company, Theodor Hayden, stated that he can clearly recall the detailed account of a former colleague. This witness claims to have been told by the company's goldsmith, Alfred Knotz, before the latter's death in the 1960s about a golden cauldron weighing more than 10 kilograms with a figurative ornament and manufactured by the means of the paddle and anvil technique. The cauldron is manufactured in Hayden's workshop between 1925 and 1939, according to Knotz. Now, the director of the company that commissioned this, Albert Peitz, is said to have been a well-known customer in the goldsmith's workshop. Peitz, an engineer who was in personal contact with Hitler from 1920 onward, provided him with generous donations. And Alfred's investment originally paid off pretty well because he became a member of the Nazi Party in 1927 and then later rose to the position of military economy leader and even became the president of the Chamber of Commerce for the Reich. Peitz was ultimately arrested by the Allies at the end of the war, but if he did know anything about the cauldron or its whereabouts at that time, he took it to his grave when he died in 1957. Now, because the cauldron is linked to the Nazi elite, it did actually take on this humorous nickname called Hitler's Bedpan, and that's what it was known as until 2011 when a Swiss magazine called Mysteries published an astonishing article claiming that it found personal documents belonging to Henrich Himmler, and they were found in an attic in Germany. And with these documents, there was a weird movement order for precious stones, silver, gold, and one precarious item simply referred to as gold cauldron. But that wasn't the only revelation in the Nazi paperwork. The name Otto Gar was printed right there with it. Otto Gar is a name you may not be familiar with, but if you've ever studied the Nazis, you're pretty familiar with his handiwork. Gar was a member of the Nazi elite. He was a jeweler and a silversmith, and his most famous works are the death's head rings that the SS officers would wear. This was the guy who would clearly be picked to undergo such a project like crafting a golden cauldron. Now, it's speculated that Albert Peitsch commissioned Otto Gar to make the cauldron, and Gar sought out Alfred Notz because he was a goldsmith. Okay, so we have an estimated chain of command for the Kisme Cauldron, but why was it created and who was the intended recipient of it? We don't know. But let's go back to that Nazi movement order that belonged to Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was the head of the SS. He was like Hitler's William Riker, if we're going to make a Star Trek reference. And he also was super into the occult. He believed in the purity of the Teutons. This was a tribe of Germanic peoples first written about by Roman authors. Though their history is lost to time, some researchers believe that their origins are in fact Celtic. This would add to the imagery that's on the Kisme Cauldron, so I think that Himmler also believed this theory. The Teutons were what Himmler based his master race theory on. These were the OG, the original Germans. Yeah, I said it. Now, Himmler created the SS to live up to the ideals of the Teutonic Knights. This was a group that dedicated themselves to an idea that was just simply higher, and he wanted them to be pure. But that's clearly for another story. Earlier, I mentioned the claim that the cauldron was being touted as the new Holy Grail. Well, it's possible that was its ceremonial intent. You see, in 1933, a German writer named Otto Rahn published a book titled Crusade Against the Grail. This actually caught the attention of Himmler, who was also fascinated by the search for the Holy Grail. Himmler himself had actually started searching for the Grail and had brought in Otto Rahn to help with that research in the south of France. Now, Otto clearly never found the Holy Grail, and in fact, his end is pretty sad in its own right. To give you the long, short version of this thing, he actually tried to quit the SS after being punished for a drunken homosexual escapade, discovered that the SS were actually trying to arrest him or kill him, so he just up and noped out in the middle of the night. And about a year later, his body was discovered frozen on the side of a mountain. They ruled it a suicide. But Alfred Notz did claim that the cauldron was made between 1925 and 1939, so it's actually impossible to accurately determine many of the details here. But it is possible that the cauldron was being made as a substitute for the Grail. Maybe Himmler and company wanted to make it seem like they found the Holy Grail. Modeling it after the Kelten Gundenstrup cauldron would seem like a good enough idea at the time, especially if the golden cauldron was going to be used for ceremonial purposes. I mean, we'll never really truly know. But then the final question becomes, how did the Kisme Cauldron end up in the lake? There might actually be a working theory for that. You see, when the Nazis took over Germany, they created several schools in the name of Adolf Hitler. These schools were basically where they trained young SS boys and some SS girls. But the Nazis wanted to create this advanced high school on the shores of Lake Chiemsee. And this advanced school was an elite Nazi university, a kind of academy for party officials. It is possible that Himmler had sent the cauldron to the school for the ceremonies with the Nazi elite, and when the war ended, someone came, grabbed it, and then threw it into the lake to stop it from being pilfered by the Americans. And just like the Gundenstrup cauldron being found in a bog, the person never came back for it. But where's the cauldron now, in 2021? Well, I don't have a definite answer for that, but I do think that it's possible that it's locked away in a vault in Texas. Let me explain. Remember that intrepid treasure hunter Jens Essig from before? Well, he reappeared in 2014 when magically the cauldron reappeared on the market of a Swiss bankruptcy sale. He sought out an investor to purchase it, and he found one by the name of Joseph Hotzenbuehler, who was actually a retired engineer living in Texas. Hotzenbuehler, according to an eventual lawsuit filed against Essig, claimed that he was told that the cauldron was of Celtic origin and that he needed to quickly act to purchase it. He agreed, and he paid roughly $1.1 million for the cauldron, had it packaged, shipped to Texas, where it was promptly put in a storage locker for safekeeping. The idea here, at least, according to a few online reports that I found, was that Essig claims that he agreed to be paid 50% of the earnings if Hotzenbuehler had in fact sold the cauldron. Hotzenbuehler denied this and ultimately sued Essig in Texas court for fraud, fraudulent inducement, negligent misrepresentation, and breach of contract. He was upset that not only was the cauldron not of Celtic origin, is that it was manufactured during World War II which ultimately makes it significantly less valuable. I think at this point it's like 400,000. Sadly, though, Hatzenbuehler died before the case could be decided in court, but Essig was able to actually argue that Texas courts didn't have jurisdiction over him as a German citizen, and the court agreed and dismissed the case. So Hatzenbuehler's wife, Brigitte, took up the cause and filed an appeal, but the courts sided with Essig again. Sadly, this is the last bit of information I'm able to find on the Kisme Cauldron right now, and I would like to think that given the fact that Hatzenbuehler was the last legal owner that we know of, that his wife still has it. But it is possible that the pain from losing the fraud lawsuit was enough to get her to just offload it. Or it's possible that Essig was able to obtain it once again. Who knows? Unless more documentation is discovered as time goes on, I highly doubt we're going to get to the true bottom of whatever this cauldron was made for, who ordered it, why they ordered it, so on and so forth. The mysteries of World War II are one of the reasons why we keep talking about it, because we will never get to know all of the information, and we're left speculating with these amazing stories that just seem so absolutely batshit crazy. This was one that absolutely caught my attention from the moment I read about it, and I loved diving into this story. If you guys have any idea about the Kisme Cauldron, if there's anything here that you think I missed, anything here you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know. I'll talk to you guys later. Have yourself a great day. Thank you for watching this episode of Stranger Days, and peace out.